For the first time in well over a decade, I went to a movie theater to see what the American cinema experience was like. I watched Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, and it was a fantastic movie. But all I could think about, almost like an obsession, was how awesome it would be to see a brand new Metal Max game. This isn't the first time this has happened with me either, as I had a similar thought after watching Mad Max Fury Road in 2015. Shortly after I had first discovered the Metal Max series of JRPGs, well over 2 decades after the first game launched in Japan in 1991. After I watched Mad Max Fury Road, I went back and binged the entire Mad Max series too, since Fury Road was my first Mad Max film as well. And all that was on my mind as I watched these movies was how they felt like film adaptations of side quests in Metal Max. And this isn't a one-way street. After watching all of the Mad Max films, it's likewise difficult for me not to think of Mad Max while I'm playing any Metal Max game too. Yes, I know, I have a gamer brain, but hear me out here. Mad Max definitely came first as a media franchise, and while it was my first association with Metal Max, I was surprised to find translated interviews of creator Hiroshi Miyaoka and programmer-director Tomoki Tauchi from Createch after the release of Metal Max 4 Diva of the Moonlight, in which they talk quite a bit about the development process of the Metal Max series and the things that influenced it. In 2 separate interviews, Hiroshi Miyaoka talks about Mad Max. In the 2014 developer interview in Japanese magazine Role-Playing Game Side No. 1, translated by Shmuplations, which I've linked to below, Miyaoka states, "Personally, with the original Mad Max, it always felt to me like it's not post-apocalyptic. It's just Australia. The police are just less organized and there's not much talk of fuel either, and people are living normal lives. I guess the budget was a factor, but I thought it was naive for a science fiction doomsday theme." Of course, this was in reference only to the first Mad Max film, which, while the post-apocalyptic dystopian themes were there along with the gangs, the awesome and varied vehicles and more organized gang settlements with their own agendas along with the importance of fuel weren't a part of that world yet. These are the features in future Mad Max films that also shape the settings of the Metal Max games. Although the tanks in Metal Max are electrically powered and controlled through a C unit or a computer unit rather than fuel. In Digitally Downloaded's interview in September 2018, Hiroshi Miyaoka mentioned that the original Metal Max Xeno's key motif is the use of tanks in combat. The decision to do this was to blend one of Mad Max's most well-known features, that being the vehicles being iconic to the point where they have their own personalities, and a bit of subversive imagery to help sell the sense of a brutally violent and hostile world. In his own words, he says, "We know that in China there is something of a taboo on tanks appearing in the media because of the violence that they represent and their efficiency in crushing the weak. And so, a tank can be seen as a symbol for something hostile, like an enemy or war itself. We wanted to really focus Metal Max on the violence and sheer powerfulness of tanks, so that's why we wanted to make this game exclusively about tanks, where in previous Metal Max titles, other vehicles also made an appearance." More interestingly, to me at least, than the obvious Mad Max comparisons was the wealth of other influences Hiroshi Miyaoka mentioned in the 2014 interview. The 1966 film Battle of the Bulge was brought up for how the German army's high-performance tanks ran out of fuel and were reduced to lumps of steel. The thought that tanks were hunks of trash without bullets came to mind, which led him to question the idea with the thought, what is a tank? When asked specifically about the post-apocalyptic setting of the world, his answer was much broader. He got his inspiration from the golden age of science fiction film in the US in the 1950s when the Cold War was in full swing. The then current popularity of Fist of the North Star in Japan also meant he knew the trope of a post-apocalyptic world would be immediately recognized in Metal Max. As a brief aside, Fist of the North Star's setting was also influenced by Mad Max and the manga Violence Jack. Check out Fist of the North Star manga artist Tetsuo Hara's very recent fan art for Furiosa. Of course, instead of vehicular combat, Fist of the North Star features exploding heads, which is also fun, but not the topic of this video. Anyways, in regards to works with post-apocalyptic themes, Hiroshi Miyaoka mentioned being most impressed with the film On the Beach for how there was no great drama, just people dying from the encroaching nuclear war radiation. He also mentioned Damnation Alley, which has a really awesome, at least for 1977, custom-designed vehicle called a Landmaster that looks like it came straight out of a Metal Max game or Mad Max film. The mutated wildlife in Damnation Alley may have also influenced some of the biomonsters that appear in the Metal Max series. The most surprising influence mentioned, at least to me, was the novel Bill, the Galactic Hero, which was described by author Terry Pratchett as being the funniest science fiction novel ever written. Miyaoka said the style of humor in that novel is quite similar to Metal Max in taste, and reflects how he names a lot of the wacky enemies in the Metal Max series like the One-Shot Wonder. Miyaoka mentioned a lot of the comedy in Metal Max from the dialogue, enemy names, and enemy attacks, like Ted Broiler's Mohican Slugger came from the kind of humor in Bill the Galactic Hero. It's the kind of attack that will make you laugh when you see it and cry when you get hit by it. On a more serious note, he says he thinks emotions like laughter and fear are close in nature, like beauty and ugliness. He tries to show these facets together to create something new and interesting. The blend of humor and and drama in the Metal Max series is interesting to say the least, and it does lighten up some of the series' darker moments. This interview goes into more depth, but it's clear that Hiroshi Miyaoka was also inspired heavily by cowboy westerns and Japanese sci-fi media too. Metal Max was originally a board game concept before it grew into a full-fledged video game. But since Dragon Quest was such a monumental influence at the time, what with Hiroshi Miyaoka working on that series since its inception and its massive popularity, they decided to differentiate from the fantasy setting with science fiction. Developer Tomoki Tauchi mentioned being extremely excited to work on Metal Max because he wanted to make RPGs ever since he joined the game company. He moved on from programmer and UI designer in the early Metal Max games to story writer and director for the series from the year 2000 and onwards. All kinds of science fiction and action movies influenced his writing for the games to the point where he just said, if something in the Metal Max games reminds you of something, that's probably because he got the idea from it. Both Miyaoka and Tauchi mentioned Metal Max 3 as being the most memorable game in the series for them. It took them a really long time to write the story and plot for the game, and the hero of the game, Drumcan, is a favorite of Tauchi's. It was an important shift from neutral and conspicuous player character avatars in previous games to a standout character. The game's producer wanted the game to be balanced for beginners to enjoy and include a standout main character. So the team decided to make Drumcan immortal from the start, and the larger story sort of grew from that foundation. Hiroshi Miyaoka's favorite character in the series is the titular character Red Wolf from the first Metal Max, whose similarly named vehicle became something of a flagship vehicle appearing in all the Metal Max games. When designing the character, he thought of how Yuji Horii writes the characters in the Dragon Quest games. What he says here really resonated with me and touches on why I love Metal Max so much from a minimalist narrative perspective. Miyaoka states, "You see, at heart, I'm a Dragon Quest guy, so I'm not very inclined to make expository, overly talky characters like in Final Fantasy. But that doesn't mean I can just dispense with story entirely. And what I hit upon as a way to get players emotionally involved was the idea that you are witnessing someone else's life play out. So in creating Red Wolf, I think I grasped the most suitable form for me for how to write an RPG. The first time I played Metal Max, I thought Red Wolf was such an awesome character. You meet him early and learn more about him from the people you talk to on your journey. He has very few spoken lines, but by the time you've reached the end of the story, he almost feels like the legend everyone makes him out to be. And driving his tank is as satisfying as that top-tier class change in an RPG, or the moment in any RPG when you start to feel like your character has become a big deal in the world of the game." Miyaoka goes on to explain how he approached things in Metal Max in the Yuji Horii style, as far as the overall flow of the game goes, except with one key difference. Instead of intertwining the past and present to draw out emotions in the storytelling like Yuji Horii, Miyaoka strived for something different. He tried to eliminate the sentimental things as much as possible to create a bleak world and create an entirely different atmosphere from the first 3 Dragon Quest games he helped design with Yuji Horii. Looking back, he thinks he was too particular about it, but they were striving to make a million-unit selling game at the time too. In scenarios in later Metal Max games, there are plenty of irreversible decisions that affect the non-playable characters in the games, but not so much the player's gameplay. Miyaoka specifically avoids the "but thou must" trope by letting the player's actions or inactions decide the fates of other characters involved in the scenarios. The mosquito repellent seller in Shelter in Metal Max 3 was mentioned for how you have the choice to buy repellent from her every time you talk to her when you visit the town. Instead of forcing the purchase, the game will just continue. And if you don't buy enough from her, her family, represented by other NPCs in the town, will die. It actually shocked people when it happened because they were conditioned on other JRPGs not to care about the consequences of their actions in games. The most famous Yuji Horii game that sort of does this is Chrono Trigger in regards to the player's actions in Lean Square during the Millennial Fair, but the consequences aren't nearly as brutal. Celeste can also neglect Cid in Final Fantasy VI, even accidentally, and lead to an irreparable outcome. Quests like the one in Shelter are one of the reasons I love Metal Max's scenarios and side quests. Because your choices have real irreparable consequences, they're much more meaningful and memorable. Xenoblade Chronicles Cross, another open world game, has a few quests like this too, where the decision branches change the outcomes of the quest instead of faking choices for players. The ultimate scenario outcomes by no means ruin a player's ability to get great items and enjoy the game, but they do change things in the game's world as far as the NPCs go. Tauchi did mention some regret over the Shelter scenario in Metal Max 3, since it seemed like he was deliberately trying to depress people when he really just wanted to create a unique side quest experience compared to other games. Marilyn from Metal Max 2 was Miyaoka's favorite female character. Marilyn's line, "I wanted to know more about love," during her storyline brought him to tears while writing it. He was inspired by The Terminator, where a character is asked whether a robot could become self-aware. He explored the theme a little more with Sasha from Metal Max 4. Different characters in Metal Max 3 and 4 were named Marilyn too to invoke memories of Metal Max 2. When the interviewer made a comment that looking at Metal Max as a whole made him wonder if Miyaoka liked stories where the women betray the men, Miyaoka said, "I think deep down maybe I have a desire to be betrayed in love. Maybe it's related to the longing for a burning, passionate romance. I don't know. Of course, in reality, no one wants to experience that, but the game allows us to experience it safely. It was something I'd wanted to put in a game for a long time. This explains more than a few of the side story themes in various Metal Max games, and might touch on the overall popularity of genres like Netorare or NTR in adult media in Japan overall. Metal Max's fun song titles like Tears of a 7mm Machine Gun were also created by Hiroshi Miyaoka in an effort to stave off generic song names like Dungeon 1, Dungeon 2, etc., especially when these songs might be used at more than one specific time playing the games. Hiroshi Miyaoka was friends with series artist Atsuji Yamamoto since high school. Miyaoka would give Yamamoto weird sketches and storyboards, while Yamamoto would just make the enemy designs even wackier. That explains weird enemies like the gasoline tanks with legs, the syringe-wielding birds, the spear-fishing frogmen, and the crazy walking bombs. The interview also talks about Metal Max games that never came to be, namely Metal Max 3 on the PlayStation, which was glanced over, and Metal Max Wild Eyes on the Dreamcast, that had reached 70% completion before it was cancelled. In particular, for Metal Max Wild Eyes, the story became so grandiose they had to cut out entire maps, which also cut out the wanted monster, and tank locations. There was apparently also a very spicy scene where the hero and heroine were separated from the rest of their party and would embrace each other naked in a cave in the Winter Mountains. She mentioned a scene like that with today's hardware would get them an X rating. Also, the dev team spent hours playing EverQuest during the development of Metal Max Wild Eyes. Some of the characters and songs from Wild Eyes were reused in Metal Max 4. The talk of cancelled Metal Max games in 2014 particularly stings for me here in 2024, several years after learning the latest Metal Max game aiming to release in 2022, Metal Max Wild West, was also cancelled. But I hold out hope that Cygames is going to throw their huge stinky wad of Grand Blue Fantasy gacha capital into an ambitious Metal Max JRPG experience that will also see a release in the West. Strict video game regulations were also talked about, and how they affected the development of the Metal Max games. In particular, the master version of Metal Max 2 featured charred dead bodies everywhere in the opening scene in the game, and Nintendo was furious, so they had to censor them. Miyaoka mentioned that as being one of their Dragon Quest antithesis points, as it shows ugliness and reality as opposed to Dragon Quest fantasy and dreams. He questions the rationality behind hiding that reality, and goes on to say he specifically chooses to have the characters use abusive language towards each other. In my personal opinion, it also sells the brutal reality of Metal Max's survival of the fittest world, where people aren't nice to each other, because the nicest people typically don't last long in this world. Hiroshi Miyaoka also doesn't shy away from depicting characters in Metal Max with lovers and girlfriends. He says that lust is one of a human's strongest desires, and including it would get players' attention. They try to consciously avoid going too deep into the male fantasy though. He's careful to make sure there are strong female characters in the games so that it never reaches a point of chauvinism. Just like the original Metal Max has the female soldier, Metal Max 2 has protagonist Rena and the famous soldier Maria who raises her. Metal Max 3 has the strong female villain Olga Mode, and more heroic characters like Kasumi, who are not only dangerous but also older and very experienced. Metal Max Xeno and Xeno Reborn also have Maria, who is physically strong, and other playable female characters who have strong skills for battle. Metal Saga has the cowgirl soldier Charlene, who can join your party, and the extraordinarily dangerous Scarlet, who is an experienced hunter and probably one of the most powerful characters in any Metal Max game. This was another easy comparison I made to the Mad Max series, with strong female villains like Anti-Entity in Mad Max Beyond Thunderdrome. Heroines like Furiosa in the recent Mad Max movie remind me a lot of Rena from Metal Max 2, as both of their stories are revenge-driven. But Metal Max 2 does the popular JRPG thing and becomes more than that by the end of the game. In fact, it really is a lot like many Dragon Quest games, where the game sets up a main villain at the beginning, but when you reach the end of the game, you're fighting something entirely different. In Mad Max, driving skill is very important, and in the Metal Max games, it actually has its own stat that determines how effective characters are in vehicles. Film director George Miller is open about his feminist views and portrays them in the Mad Max films with powerful female characters. There's very little emphasis on romance in the films, whereas Metal Max can end at player-specified points by forgetting about the violent bounties and barren world, and spending the rest of their lives with other characters, often romantically. There are many scenarios involving romance between other characters in quests, and scenarios that can end in a variety of ways depending on the player's actions or neglect of actions. Romance is even the driving force for Red Wolf's story in the first Metal Max game. But beyond all the awesome vehicles, strong female characters, the word Max in the titles, and the blasted desertified world, there are other things that just make me associate Mad Max and Metal Max with each other so easily. Check out these character and enemy designs. And even the eccentric vehicles and tools the War Boys use in Mad Max look similar to enemy and bounty designs in Metal Max. Max from Mad Max was originally occasionally a cop, and at least a few Metal Max games have a police vehicle that can be used in battle. You can also attach drills as weapons onto vehicles in later games in Metal Max, which makes me think of scenes like this one in Mad Max. Then there's the dogs in both Metal Max and Mad Max, though the ones in Metal Max look a little cuter in my opinion. Of course, vehicular JRPG combat and open world exploration are at the crux of Metal Max's gameplay. Metal Max leans much more heavily into other popular aspects of apocalyptic science fiction than Mad Max does, with varying importance in the stories of the different games involving androids, biomutants, genetic engineering, and rogue artificial intelligence. This is such a huge part of why I am so obsessed with the series and think the series still has so much untapped potential, even here in 2024, more than 30 years since the first game came out in 1991. Heck, the first Metal Max might also be the first video game portrayal of an artificial intelligence apocalypse in a video game, a very real concern here in 2024. The Mad Max franchise is extraordinarily popular in Japan, with famous creatives like Hideo Kojima of Metal Gear Solid fame finding inspiration in the film. And Furiosa is absolutely killing it in Japan despite its poor performance in the United States. That's why it doesn't really surprise me at all to see so much of Mad Max and Metal Max and vice versa, seeing as the game is a Japanese RPG and Mad Max is popular in Japan. Hopefully both Metal Max and Mad Max continue to have futures in their respective mediums. Thank you for watching and have a great day.